Jimmy Superfly Snuka was everything the WWE could have hoped for in a wrestler. Good looking, exciting to watch, and a fan favorite, but one fateful night in 1983 derailed it all for the Superfly, when his mistress, Nancy Argentino, was found dead in their hotel room. Snuka was the prime suspect for the murder because there is a mountain of evidence proving that he was indeed the one who took Nancy's life. Not to mention, he constantly changed stories of what happened to Nancy. However, at the last second, the notorious Vince McMahon showed up and handed off a mysterious briefcase, presumably with money inside it, to the investigators of the case. McMahon essentially used his power to make a murder case go cold for the sake of one of his top stars. This is the story of how Vince McMahon covered up a murder.
Wrestler has just been charged with the 1983 murder of his 23-year-old Brooklyn girlfriend, Nancy Argentino.
Jimmy Snuka, real name James Wiley Smith, was born in the British colony of Fiji on May 18, 1943, and even from his conception, Jimmy's circumstances were complicated. His father, Charles Thomas, was married to another woman, and his mother, Louisa Smith, was engaged to be married to another man. His mother and her fiancé would wed before Jimmy's birth. Jimmy would eventually take his stepfather's name, becoming James Ryher. The family would move around in Jimmy's youth, first to the Marshall Islands before settling in Hawaii. Jimmy would enter the Hawaiian bodybuilding circuit in the 1960s and found great success, collecting the titles of Mr. Hawaii, Mr. Waikiki, and Mr. North Shore. It was also around this time that Jimmy met and married Sharon Ely, the daughter of Samoan chief and member of the legendary Anoa'i family. Jimmy worked out at the famed Dean Ho Gym, a popular spot among Hawaiian wrestlers and bodybuilders. Through this workout spot, Jimmy became friendly with a number of wrestlers in the area, including Carl Gotch and Don Muraco. Despite his success on the bodybuilding circuit, it was said that Snuka was living tough financially, with Muraco commenting that he didn't even know where Snuka was sleeping most days. Seeking a more lucrative and steady career than bodybuilding, Jimmy started to shift into professional wrestling. He trained under wrestler Danny Hodge and made his debut in Hawaii in 1970 under the name Jimmy Kealoha. He would soon transition to the NWA Northwest Territory in Seattle, where he would adopt the name Jimmy Snuka. The moniker would stick with him for the rest of his life. Snuka would bounce around various NWA territories throughout the decade and found great success before finally catching the eye of Vince McMahon in the early 1980s. Snuka was known for a high-flying, wild man style, heavily influenced by Tarzan, and McMahon saw potential in him within the WWE. So he signed for Vince McMahon, and he was originally positioned as a heel. It became apparent fairly early on that Snuka was loved by the fans, so Vince McMahon decided to make the switch, turning Snuka face. As part of the change, McMahon instilled the legendary Buddy Rogers as Snuka's manager, both in and out of the ring. At the shows, Rogers spoke for Snuka and acted as his hype man before and during matches. But outside of matches, Rogers was also Snuka's de facto handler. He would drive Snuka, who never had a license, from venue to venue. He would also help his financial affairs and was generally tasked with taking care of the wrestler that was quickly gaining popularity and profitability for the WWE. One of WWE's most important and frequented venues during this time was Madison Square Garden in New York City. That's where the young Nancy Argentino first met Superfly Jimmy Snuka. Argentino had a friend who was engaged to wrestler Johnny Rodz, so the two would frequently go to shows in order to watch him perform. While backstage at a show at MSG, Argentino ran into Jimmy Snuka, and despite their 16-year age difference, the two quickly hit it off. Despite having a wife and 4 kids at home, Snuka was reportedly lonely on the road, a phenomenon common with wrestlers around that time. Also common among wrestlers in this era was having multiple women in multiple cities, and Snuka reportedly also followed suit in that regard. Snuka was also starting to become more difficult for Rogers to control as he got more into the hedonistic lifestyle of wrestlers in the 1980s. The Superfly began to get into drugs, specifically coke, and as time wore on, Rogers expressed concern that Snuka's personality would change for the worse whenever he was high. After a road trip that allegedly included Snuka attempting to snort coke while Rogers was driving, Rogers told McMahon that he could no longer continue acting as Snuka's handler because the superstar was starting to become uncontrollable. Still in need for someone to watch over Snuka, the role was essentially given to Argentino, who was now dating Snuka and had dropped out of Brooklyn Community College to travel the Northeast loops with him. Snuka was open with Argentino about the fact that he was actually married, a fact that the couple would keep secret from Argentino's family for some time in order to gain their approval. The couple spent Thanksgiving together with Argentino's family and even planned on purchasing a townhouse in New Jersey together. As far as they could tell, the two seemed to be legitimately in love with each other. And with Argentino taking over as Snuka's handler, she began to feel that Jimmy and his career truly needed her, and Snuka started to become far more protective of Nancy among the other wrestlers. But things between the two weren't perfect, and the cracks began to show in late 1982. Nancy's sister claimed that while having dinner with the couple one night, Snuka, who had become annoyed by Nancy's sister's constant talking, threatened to choke her. Upset and frightened by this, Nancy's sister left the table and Nancy tried to play it off as Snuka just being stressed from work. Snuka then attempted to apologize to Nancy's sister by allegedly offering her coke, which Nancy quickly put a stop to. Nancy's family also started to report changes in her personality, saying that Argentino was becoming more shy and timid during her relationship with Snuka. Argentino's stepfather was allegedly always wary of Snuka, and now the rest of her family was starting to wonder if this wrestler was really what was best for Nancy. To make things worse, Nancy started showing up to her family with cuts and bruises, but she refused to leave Jimmy. She was basically stuck in this relationship, and Jimmy had her addicted to the same drugs that he used. The red flags continued to pop up in a major way on January 18th, 1983 in Salina, New York. Coming back to Argentino at the motel they were staying at after a wrestling match in Syracuse, Snuka reportedly began to get upset with Nancy for not paying attention to him while he was trying to watch television. Soon after, other guests at the motel began to report hearing sounds of a struggle, saying that it sounded like a man was potentially beating up a woman. The police were called and arrived to find Snuka outside naked and Argentino covered only in a sheet, shouting at him to get away. Snuka forced the two back into the motel room and shut the door on the police, refusing to allow them to enter and forbidding Argentino to leave. With Argentino still shouting to be let go and Snuka refusing to cooperate with the police, backup was called, resulting in 9 police officers and 2 police dogs forcing the door of the motel open. Snuka proceeded to fight the officers who had entered the motel, pushing one against the wall before finally being subdued by a chokehold with a nightstick. He fought for several minutes before he could finally be handcuffed. The Superfly was formally charged with 3rd-degree assault, 2nd-degree attempted assault, resisting arrest, and obstructing a government official. He was held in county jail and assigned a $5,000 bail. This very well could have put an end to the entire affair, but there were 2 major issues. The first was in the reporting of the incident. The fight in Salina did get national attention, but not for the salacious news of a married wrestler cheating on his wife or for potentially assaulting his girlfriend, but rather for the tussle Snuka had with the police. Most media outlets found a degree of humor in a half-naked wrestler fighting off multiple waves of police officers and dogs. This buried the more damning nature of the potential crimes. The second was Nancy's unwillingness to address the nature of the incident. The detective that was investigating this case wrote that Vince McMahon tried to talk Nancy Argentino out of making a complaint against Snuka, and because of all of this pressure, she decided not to press charges against him. In the ensuing weeks, Argentino's family attempted to convince Nancy to dump Snuka, saying that she was too smart and too pretty to be putting up with things like that, but she refused time and time again. 1 month after being cleared of the Salina incident, Snuka and Argentino headed to Allentown, Pennsylvania, another WWE stronghold, for a series of television tapings. The two were staying at the same motel many of the wrestlers were, the George Washington Motor Lodge. On May 10th, 1983, Snuka left Argentino for the day to tape the show. Snuka returned to the motel a bit after filming, before going out again for the rest of the day to drink with some of the wrestlers. Throughout all of this time, no one saw or heard from Nancy, who spent the entire day inside the motel room. In Snuka's version of events, upon returning that night, he found Argentino unresponsive in his bed and struggling to breathe, and so he called for an ambulance. The paramedics who arrived at the scene described Snuka as crying and frantic, and immediately saw Argentino laying on the bed with dilated pupils and fluid oozing from her nose and mouth, a typical sign of head trauma. When asked by the paramedics what had happened, Snuka gave the first of what would be many conflicting accounts of what left Nancy Argentino in that state. He claimed to the paramedics that he and Nancy were playfully wrestling the night before and that Argentino had accidentally hit her head on the wall. The next day, he said that Argentino was lethargic, so he let her sleep in bed all day. When he returned, he noticed that she had difficulty breathing and decided to call for help. Argentino was rushed to the Sacred Heart Medical Center, and while there, Snuka's story began to shift. He reportedly told ER personnel that there was some form of a conflict between himself and Nancy the night before, and that after he pushed her, she hit her head on the wall. Despite efforts to resuscitate the 23-year-old Nancy Argentino, she was pronounced dead within 2 hours. The coroner's report, which would stay hidden for almost 30 years, stay tuned for that later in the video, stated that Argentino died of traumatic brain injuries consistent with a moving head striking a stationary object. Autopsy findings show that Argentino had more than 24 cuts and bruises on her head, ear, chin, arms, hands, back, buttocks, legs, and feet. The forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy wrote at the time that the case should be investigated as a homicide until proven otherwise. Argentino's family was informed of her death, and when asking Snuka what happened to their daughter, all he could say was that she fell and hit her head. The next day, the investigation from the Allentown police began, with Snuka as the only suspect. This time, when questioned by the police about what happened to Nancy, Snuka said that on the drive into Allentown, the two pulled over so that Nancy could go to the bathroom on the side of the road. When she finished and was heading back to the car, Snuka said that she slipped and hit her head on the side of the road. In Jimmy Snuka's book later on in his life, he revealed that Vince McMahon got wind of the investigation going on, and he called the investigators and set up a meeting just 5 days after Nancy's death. In this meeting, Vince McMahon allegedly brought a briefcase with him and did majority of the talking. Vince allegedly assured the police that Snuka would continue to cooperate with the investigation on the condition that he was let go for now to continue wrestling for his company. Vince then gave them this briefcase, presumably with money inside of it, and the case was conveniently left open. Having no evidence, no witnesses, no confessions to any wrongdoing, and the mysterious briefcase, the police let Jimmy Snuka go without pressing any charges. Argentino's death was deemed an accident, despite police never actually visiting the site where Snuka claimed she fell on the side of the road. The suspicion from Argentino's family, however, never subsided, and their concerns grew after Snuka's odd behavior at Nancy's funeral. Snuka arrived at the wake in shorts and flip-flops alongside Buddy Rogers, and after loudly sobbing over the casket, he was said to comment that Nancy looked horrible. He then told the Argentinos that he would come back for the church service the next day, and although Snuka claimed that he did, the Argentinos say that he wasn't at the church service. Even more disturbing, the funeral parlor who prepared Nancy talked about all the work they had to do to make Nancy look presentable for the open casket wake due to the amount of bruising around her neck and abrasions covering her face. With Nancy's funeral now behind him, Snuka's career in the WWE continued to skyrocket. After being named Superstar of the Year in 1983 by Victory magazine, Snuka would go into a legendary rivalry with Rowdy Roddy Piper throughout the summer of 1984. But behind the scenes, things were starting to fall apart for Snuka. In October of 1983, only 5 months after the Nancy Argentino incident, another woman in Snuka's life was hospitalized. This time, it was his wife, Sharon, who filed a criminal complaint and had pictures of her beaten face. Snuka's drug and alcohol problems also worsened, landing him in rehab multiple times over the next few years and cutting short his program with Rowdy Roddy Piper. But Snuka's biggest issue was the Argentinos, who still believed that they had not received justice for Nancy's death. Since the untimely events of Allentown, the Argentinos had received phone calls from another woman who claimed to be a former girlfriend of Jimmy Snuka. She said that she had reached out to Nancy prior to her death, warning her about the broken ribs she had suffered while she was with Snuka, and said that he had a penchant for punching women against walls. The Argentinos would then commission a private investigation headed by New York lawyer Richard Cushing. The investigation proved difficult as many of the records Cushing demanded to see were still inaccessible due to the case technically never closing. Though Cushing had reason to believe that there was a case to be made against Snuka, he declined to represent the Argentinos in a wrongful death civil suit for 2 reasons. The first with Snuka and Argentino not being married, not having children, and with Argentino not working. It would be incredibly difficult to establish what the Argentinos could sue for in terms of a loss. The second was yet again Vince McMahon, who made it clear to Cushing that Nancy's reputation would be ruined if Snuka was taken to court. Undeterred, the Argentinos commissioned a second private investigation, this time with a Park Avenue law firm. Their investigators started to uncover the various shifting stories Snuka gave on that night to different people about how Nancy's head injury occurred. Though the Argentinos couldn't charge Snuka criminally, with the case being in the hands of the Allentown police, they did finally file a wrongful death lawsuit against Snuka in 1985. The basis of the suit was, regardless of how Nancy was injured, Snuka still waited at least 12 to 24 hours before calling for help and likely hastened Nancy's death. Snuka never showed up to the proceedings, and therefore a $500,000 default judgment was awarded in favor of the Argentinos. The family, however, never saw a dime of that money due to Snuka claiming financial woes. Snuka's lawyers had withdrawn from the case after not being paid, and Snuka himself filed an affidavit saying he was broke and he owed the IRS $75,000 in back taxes. Whether due to the Nancy situation or any other problems in Snuka's life, the drug problems continued to intensify, and slowly, Jimmy Snuka started to fade from the wrestling landscape. After leaving the WWE in 1986, he briefly returned from 1989 through 1993. By this time, Snuka was a shell of his former glory, used as an aging veteran to put over younger talent, including being the first of The Undertaker's WrestleMania victims in 1991. All the while, Snuka would occasionally be heckled from the crowd about his shady past, with one woman reportedly yelling, "Hey Superfly, when are you gonna kill another girl?" Despite his decline, Jimmy Snuka was still seen as a wrestling legend and was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 1996. His celebrity also saw him take many interviews over the years, but whenever the story of Nancy Argentino was brought up, Snuka told what happened in different ways. Now sticking almost exclusively with the idea of the Rhodes story, sometimes Snuka said that he didn't see Nancy fall, sometimes he did see her fall, sometimes she was jumping over a body of water and fell, and sometimes she slipped on moss, sometimes she hit her head on a guardrail, and sometimes she hit her head on the pavement. No matter how much time passed, there was still a cloud of suspicion following Snuka regarding Nancy's death, but with the case in a dormant phase, it began to fall into obscurity. That is, however, until 2011. Kevin Ammerman and Alan Clark of the Morning Call, a newspaper in Allentown, decided to take another look into the Argentino case to release an article on its 30-year anniversary. Like Cushing before them, the writers were unable to obtain either of the two documents that most interested them, Nancy Argentino's autopsy or the police records and transcript of their meeting with Snuka, because once again, the case was considered open by the Allentown police. A case that was closed, however, was a civil suit the Argentinos filed in 1985, and was through this case's files that Ammerman and Clark finally got their hands on the autopsy, and what they found was shocking. In the autopsy report, they found that her injuries were not consistent with a fall, like Snuka had claimed for the last 30 years, and instead her injuries were more indicative with a homicide. Ammerman and Clark also came across police records detailing a meeting that they had with both Snuka and Vince McMahon. This report didn't say that Vince McMahon handed them a mysterious briefcase, but in Jimmy Snuka's 2012 autobiography, this was where he told the story of Vince McMahon handing them the mysterious briefcase. The story relayed by Snuka was yet another instance of Vince McMahon getting involved in one of his wrestlers' legal battles in order to make it disappear. Though there was never distinct evidence of foul play from Vince McMahon, he certainly made his decisions regarding helping Snuka based more on business than morality. When the Argentino sent Richard Cushing on his investigation, Cushing reported that Vince told him, "I'm in the garbage business. If you think I'm going to be hurt by the revelation that one of my wrestlers is a really violent individual, you're mistaken." Upon the release of the Morning Call's article in 2013 and the ensuing public outcry, the case surrounding the death of Nancy Argentino was officially reopened and brought to a grand jury in 2015. The jury considered the new autopsy evidence along with Snuka's prior record of domestic abuse and his own words over the years of altering the story. They came to the conclusion to charge the then 72-year-old Snuka with third-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. The news sent shockwaves throughout the wrestling world, including WWE, who quietly removed Snuka from their Hall of Fame. Those held on homicide charges in Pennsylvania traditionally are not allowed to post bail, but an exception was made for Snuka because he was dealing with stomach cancer. Snuka was allowed to post 10% of a $100,000 bail and surrender his passport in order to be released from jail, because they determined that treating his cancer in custody would have been too much of a burden on the taxpayers. Attention now turned to the trial of Jimmy Snuka and whether the Argentinos would finally get the justice that they had been seeking for 32 years. Both sides agreed to forego a preliminary hearing because it was a grand jury who had already considered the case and levied the charges. In exchange, the defense received the transcripts and evidence from the most recent investigation. Snuka entered a plea of not guilty in November of 2015, but before the case could be tried, a hearing began in May of 2016 to determine if Snuka was mentally capable of even standing trial. The defense brought in a forensic pathologist who determined that Snuka was a shell of the man that he once was. It was argued that the years of brain trauma suffered in the ring had resulted in a case of CTE and dementia in Snuka that was getting worse by the month. They showed tests to prove that Snuka's brain was actually shrinking and taking his memory with it, and were concerned that standing trial would deteriorate Snuka's emotional state. They even used the famous Piper's Pit segment where Snuka's head was cracked with a coconut as an example of how Snuka came to be in this state. The prosecution countered that Snuka only began to complain about head trauma after he learned that he was under investigation, showing that Snuka made an appointment with a concussion specialist only 1 week after learning that the case was being reopened. They also showed footage of Snuka wrestling only a year earlier, going so far as to hit his legendary Superfly splash from the top rope. When the defense pointed out how gingerly Snuka was moving in the footage, the prosecution countered with flyers advertising Snuka's non-wrestling appearances as evidence that he did not have dementia. Their final blow was a 2012 poker event that Snuka competed in and won, collecting $100,000 for charity. In the end, Judge Kelly Bannock ruled that Jimmy Snuka was not mentally competent to stand trial for the murder of Nancy Argentino, declaring that they would have another hearing in 6 months to re-evaluate Snuka. 6 months later, on January 3, 2017, with Snuka's mental and physical condition worsening, Bannock dismissed the charges on Superfly because he wasn't competent enough to stand trial. Only 12 days later, Snuka would pass away at the age of 73 due to complications with stomach cancer. We unfortunately will never know the full story of what happened over those few days, and the Argentinos sadly will never get justice for the death of their daughter. Vince McMahon essentially covered up a murder and got away with it. That's not the only vile thing that Vince McMahon has done, as he covered up the brutal SA of underage ring boys in WWE in the 80s and 90s by his employees. If you want to check out the story of the ring boy scandal, click the video on screen now. Thank you for watching the video.